Everyone on the ridge had a name for Elias Crow's tower, and not one of them was kind. Fool's Chimney, the Widowmaker, that dead man's lighthouse. They laughed at the smoke rising off a hill where nothing useful ever grew. They laughed right up until the night the valley turned to glass and their own hearths went black, and the only light left in 40 miles of frozen dark was his. This is the story of the winter I stopped laughing. I'm an old man now, and I've buried better people than myself, but I have never again mistaken a stubborn fire for a foolish one. The first thing you should know about me is that I keep a ledger. Not a proper one, not the kind a real cattleman keeps, with columns and dates and the honest weight of his herd written down where the bank can read it. Mine is a fat, water-stained little book I bought off a peddler in '79, and into it I write the things I cannot say out loud. The price of feed and the death of a good dog. The name of a woman I never married. The temperature, every morning, scratched at the top of the page like a prayer I don't believe in. The morning this story starts, I wrote -11 at the top of the page, and then I sat there with the pencil shaking against the paper because my fingers wouldn't close right, and I thought, that can't be true. It's only the first week of the cold. It was true. I should explain the country, because if you've never wintered on the high plains east of the Sangers you cannot understand what we were up against, and you'll think we were stupid for what came after. We were not stupid. We were poor and proud, and we had built our lives the way our fathers had built theirs, low cabins hunkered in the draws where the wind would pass over us instead of through us, wood piles stacked against the north walls, root cellars dug deep. It was good country in a good year. The grass came up green and high in May, and the creeks ran cold off the snowpack into August, and a man with 40 head and a strong back could make something that looked, in the gold light of an autumn evening, very much like a future. We were 11 families spread across the long bowl of the valley. The Hartleys, the 2 Peterson brothers and their wives, old Maddocks who'd been there before any of us, the Greers with their 7 children, my nearest neighbor Tom Avery, a Mexican family named Reyes who ran sheep where the rest of us ran cattle, and kept to themselves out of a wariness I never blamed them for, and a handful of others whose faces I can still see but whose names the years have sanded smooth. And there was Elias. Elias Crow came to the valley 2 springs before the bad winter, and he did everything wrong. That's the kindest way I can put it. He came in a wagon that listed to one side, with a half-Apache woman he called his wife and a boy of maybe 9 who never spoke, and instead of taking up land in one of the draws like a sensible man, he drove that broken wagon straight up the bald hump of a hill we called the Dead Hill, because nothing grew on it, because the wind owned it, because in living memory no one had been fool enough to try. And there, on the most exposed ground in the whole valley, he started to build. We watched him from below the way you watch a man you expect to fail. It is not a proud thing to admit. There is a meanness in poor people that the comfortable will never understand, a meanness born of the simple arithmetic that there is not enough, that another man's strangeness is one more thing to feed, and that the world has taught you to expect the worst and call it wisdom. We watched Elias Crow haul stone up that hill on a sledge his ox could barely drag, and we made our jokes, and we felt, God help us, we felt better for it. Because as long as there was a bigger fool than us in the valley, we were not at the bottom. He didn't build a cabin, that was the first strange thing. He built a tower. Round it was, of fieldstone and mortar he mixed himself, with walls that started near 3 feet thick at the base and tapered as they rose. The boy carried water. The woman, her name was Dawn, though Elias called her by an Apache word I never learned to say right and which I have always regretted not learning. The woman fitted the stones. She had an eye for it that he didn't, I came to see later. He'd lay a stone and she'd shake her head and turn it a quarter and it would settle into the wall like it had grown there. They worked through that whole first summer while the rest of us put up hay. By first snow they had a tower maybe 15 feet high with a roof of poles and sod, and at the center of it, on a great flat hearthstone he'd dragged up from the creek, a fire. That was the thing the laughter fixed on in the end, the fire. because Elias Crow announced, and he was not a man who announced things, which is why it stuck in everyone's craw that he intended to keep that fire burning. Not a household fire that you bank at night and stir in the morning, a fire that would never go out. Day and night, summer and winter, year over year, for as long as he drew breath, and after he said if his boy was any kind of son. He'd built the whole tower around it. The thick walls were to hold the heat. The shape was to let the smoke draw clean. The hearth was big enough to burn a windfall log for 2 days. He'd thought about it the way the rest of us thought about water rights and grass, with that much care and more. I asked him why, once. It was the only real conversation we had before the bad winter, and I have turned it over so many times in the years since that I no longer trust my memory of the words, only the shape of them. I'd ridden up the dead hill in October with a side of antelope, because my mother raised me to bring a thing when you call on a neighbor, even a neighbor you've laughed at, and maybe especially then. He was splitting wood. He set the axe down and looked at me with those pale, tired eyes. He was younger than his face, I think. The work had aged him, and when I asked, "Why a fire that never dies, Elias? What's it for?" he didn't answer the way a sensible man would have, with talk of warmth or cooking or keeping off the wolves. He said, because everything I ever loved went cold while I was looking the other way. And then he picked the axe back up, and I understood I was meant to go. I didn't tell the others that. I told them he was touched in the head, which is what they wanted to hear, and we laughed, and I wrote the real thing in my ledger that night where no one would read it. He's keeping the fire for the dead. He just doesn't know how to say so. I have thought since that I understood him better than I let myself believe, and that the laughter I joined in with was a kind of cowardice, a way of not looking at the thing in him that was also in me. The cold came early, and it came wrong. I want to be careful here, because what happened that winter has grown in the telling, not just mine, everyone's, and I don't want to make it into a tale. It was not a tale while we were living it. It was a slow, stupid, grinding kind of dying that we none of us saw coming because it came dressed as ordinary weather. The first storm was just a storm. 2 feet hard wind, the usual. We dug out. The second came 3 days behind it and dropped another 2 feet on ground that hadn't thawed, and the wind packed it into the draws, into our draws, the clever sheltered draws our fathers had chosen, until the snow stood level with the eaves and we tunneled to our own wood piles. Still, that was a hard winter and not a killing one. We'd seen hard winters. Maddox said it would break in January like it always did. It did not break in January. By the middle of that month the temperature fell and stayed fallen, and that was the thing none of us had a memory or a strategy for. Cold so deep and so constant that it stopped being weather and became a fact of the world like gravity. The creeks froze solid to the bed. The cattle's breath made beards of ice that locked their jaws. A man's spit would tick and freeze before it hit the snow. I heard it do that, a tiny crystalline tick, and I will hear it until I die. And the wood ran out. You have to understand how it happens, because no one believes it could happen to them. You lay in your wood in the fall figuring on a normal winter and a little to spare. But a normal winter you bank the fire low through the warm part of the day. This winter there was no warm part of the day. You burned through the night to keep the children from freezing in their beds, and you burned through the morning, and you burned at noon when the sun was a pale coin you couldn't feel. And the woodpile that should have lasted to April was gone before February, and the timber was a mile off downhill through snow that would swallow a horse. And a man who went for wood in that cold and broke a leg or simply tired was a man who did not come back. The Greers' woodpile went first because there were 9 of them. Then the Petersons. By the first week of February the whole valley was burning furniture, fence rails. The wagon Tom Avery had brought his bride west in. I burned my own ledger shelf and would have burned the ledger, but I could not. I am ashamed and not ashamed to say I could not put my own words in the fire. And up on the dead hill every night, the smoke rose straight and steady from Elias Crow's tower into a sky so cold the stars looked frozen in place. Steady, never wavering, while our hearths guttered and spat and went, one by one, to coals and then to ash and then to a cold that came up through the floor like the breath of the ground itself. No one laughed at the tower anymore, but no one would go to it either. That was pride, and it was the meanness I told you about, and it was something else too, a kind of shame so total that freezing felt cleaner than knocking on the door of the man we'd called a fool. I felt all three. I sat in my cold cabin with a wool blanket frozen stiff at the edge where my breath had wet it, and I watched that smoke through the one square of window I kept scraped clear, and I hated him a little for being right, which is the ugliest thing the human heart does and the most common. The thing that broke it was the Greer child. I didn't see it happen. I have only what Sarah Greer told me afterward, in pieces, over the years, the way you tell a thing you can only stand to look at sideways. The youngest Greer was a girl of 2 called Iris. On the night of the worst cold, I have it in my ledger -31, and I believe it was colder than my poor thermometer could read. The Greer's last fire died at perhaps 3 in the morning. They had burned everything. The table. The cradle the older children had used and Iris still slept in. They burned that too, which tells you the place they had come to. And in the deepest cold of that deepest night, with 7 children and 2 grown people pressed together under every blanket and hide they owned, the baby stopped crying. A parent knows the difference between a child gone quiet and a child gone still. Sarah Greer knew. She told me she put her cracked lips to her daughter's face and felt the faintest warmth, the last of it, going, and that she made a sound she did not know a human throat could make, and that her husband Daniel Greer, who was the proudest man in a valley of proud men, who had laughed loudest at the tower and led the jokes, Daniel Greer stood up in that black, cold cabin and said, "Wrap her." And he took his daughter, the dying warmth of her bundled against his own chest under his coat, and he walked out into -31 and started up the dead hill in the dark. I know what that walk cost him. Not the cold, though the cold nearly killed him. They found frostbite black on 3 of his toes that spring and he limped the rest of his life. I mean the other cost. I mean that every step up that hill was a step into the truth that he had been wrong, that the man he'd mocked might be the only thing between his child and the grave, that his pride had perhaps already cost too much. A lesser man, and I have known many and been one, would have turned back rather than face that. Daniel Greer did not turn back. He carried his daughter up the hill of the fool, and he hammered on the tower door with a fist he could no longer feel, and he wept, and he was not ashamed, because shame is a luxury and his child was dying. The door opened. Elias Crow took one look, the man, the small still bundle, the truth of it, and he did not say a word. Not "I told you so." Not "now you come." Not anything that a smaller heart would have spent that moment on. He took the child from her father's arms and carried her to the fire that never died and laid her on the warm hearthstone. And Dawn was already there with blankets they had warmed against the stones for exactly this. As though they had been waiting, as though they had known all along that the valley would come and had made ready to receive it. The baby lived. That is the part of the story everyone tells, and it is true, and it is not the part that matters. The baby lived because a fire was warm and a stone held heat, and a man kept a promise the rest of us thought was madness. But here is what Sarah told me that I have never been able to set down until now, with my own hands gone shaky and the cold of that winter 80 years behind me. When the warmth came back into the child and she began, faintly, to cry, that thin, reedy cry that is the most beautiful sound in the created world to a mother who thought it silenced, Elias Crow turned away from them. He went to the wall of his tower in the firelight, where his back was to the room. And Daniel Greer, who owed this man everything and would spend the rest of his life trying to pay it, saw the fool of the valley put his face to the cold stone and shake. Because Elias Crow had built a fire that would never die for everything he loved that had gone cold while he looked away. And on that night, for the first time, the fire had been in time. We didn't know any of that yet, those of us still down in the dark draws, still proud, still freezing. We only knew that sometime before dawn a light went up on the dead hill brighter than the steady smoke. Elias had thrown open the top of the tower and built the fire high, higher than it needed to be for warmth, a beacon you could see from every cabin in the valley, and that it stayed burning all that night and into the gray morning, a signal none of us could pretend not to understand. "There is fire here, come." I lay in my cabin and watched it, and I argued with myself the way a man does when his pride is wrestling his life and losing. I told myself I'd last till the storm broke. I told myself the others would go, and I needn't. I told myself a great many things in that cold, with my breath crackling and my ledger pencil too stiff to write the lie down. And then I heard, faint and far across the frozen valley, the sound of the Peterson brothers' dog barking as their door opened. And I understood that the going had begun. That one by one, down every draw, the proud and the freezing and the ashamed were rising in the dark, wrapping their children and their old folk, and turning their faces uphill toward the one light that hadn't gone out. I got up. My knees had gone bad in the cold, and they have never come right since. I wrapped what I could carry, and I put the ledger inside my shirt against my skin, and I opened my door into a cold that took the breath out of me like a blow, and I started up the dead hill. I was not the first to arrive. I was not the last. By the time the sun came up, that pale, heatless, beautiful sun, there were better than 30 souls crowded into and around the base of Elias Crow's tower, packed in the warmth that bled from those 3-foot walls, and his fire was burning, and his face when I saw it was not triumphant. It was afraid. He looked at the crowd of us, the whole freezing valley come crawling to his door, and I saw him do the sum that any man in his place would do, the sum I would not have had the courage to face. So many of us, and one fire, and not nearly enough wood to last the winter. He caught my eye, I don't know why mine of all of them, and he said, quiet just to me, the only thing he said to anyone that whole morning, "I built it for the dead. I don't know yet if it'll hold the living." There is a particular silence that comes over people who have just understood they might die. It is not the silence of fear. Fear is loud, it has a heartbeat in it, a held breath, the small animal scrabble of a creature looking for a way out. No, this was the silence that comes after fear has worn itself out, when the mind goes flat and clear and begins, almost against its will, to count. I have heard that silence twice in my life. Once on the dead hill, in the gray light of that first morning, and once 40 years later in a doctor's office when a man with kind eyes told me what was growing in my chest. It is the silence of arithmetic. It is the sound of a soul doing sums it does not want the answer to. We were 34 people. I counted us myself twice because I did not trust the first number, and because counting gave my frozen hand something to do. 34. When you tallied the Bobbies and old Maddocks who could not walk, and the Ray's family who had come last and quietest, climbing the hill at dawn with their faces set like men expecting to be turned away and finding, to their visible astonishment, that they were not. 34 souls in a tower built for 3. And Elias Crow's woodpile, the famous woodpile of the fool, the woodpile he had spent 2 summers cutting and curring and stacking with the obsessive care of a man building against the end of the world. That woodpile, divided by 34, by a fire that now had to burn hot enough to keep all of us from the cold pressing in at the door, by a winter that showed no sign of breaking, that woodpile was a matter of weeks, perhaps less. Elias did the sum before any of us. I told you he caught my eye and said the fire was built for the dead, and he didn't know if it would hold the living. What I did not say, because it took me years to be able to, is what was underneath those words. He had built a sanctuary, and the moment he opened his door he had turned it into a trap, a warm, bright, beautiful trap that would gather the whole valley into one place, and then, with a kind of mathematical cruelty, run out. He had perhaps doomed us all by saving us. A fire that draws the freezing to it and then dies is worse than no fire at all. He knew that. I watched him know it. A lesser man would have closed the door. I want that understood. There is a cold logic that says 3 survive easier than 34, that says the prudent thing, the survivable thing, is to keep your sanctuary small and let the valley freeze in its own pride down in the draws where it chose to settle. Elias Crow had every reason in the world to think that way. We had laughed at him for 2 years. We had named his life's work after his foolishness. And when our hour came, we had crawled to his door not in friendship but in extremity, dragging our children, owing him everything, and having given him nothing but contempt. He opened the door anyway, and having opened it, he never once, in all that followed, suggested it should have stayed shut. That, I have come to believe, is the whole of the matter. Everything else is just the story. The first day was organization, and it was Dawn who did it, not Elias. I had not understood her until that day. None of us had. She was the Apache woman, a phrase that did a great deal of work in the valley and all of it lazy. We had decided who she was the way we decided who her husband was, from a comfortable distance, and we had been as wrong about her as about everything else. She moved through that crowded, frightened tower in the gray morning, and she put us in order with a quiet authority that no man among us would have obeyed from another man, and obeyed from her without quite noticing we were doing it. The old and the very young to the inner ring, closest to the hearthstone where the heat pooled. The strong on the outer ring, backs to the cold bleeding wall, because a strong body could spare what an old one couldn't. Blankets pooled and shared, not hoarded, and she did this with a look, a single look, when a woman I will not name tried to keep her own quilt for her own family, and the look said we share or we bury, and the quilt came into the common pile. She found tasks for the idle because she understood that woman, that despair is a thing that breeds in stillness and dies in work. Melt snow for water, tend the children, watch the door. She gave us back our hands, and with our hands she gave us back a little of our souls. And she set the wood detail, which was the thing that mattered and the thing that would cost us. Because the sum was simple, and there was only one variable in it we could change. We could not make the cold less. We could not make the tower bigger or the fire smaller without freezing. The only thing in the whole equation that human will and human muscle could move was the wood, and the wood was a mile downhill, standing in the timber, beyond a field of snow that had killed men in better conditions than these. So we would go for wood. There was nothing else to do, and everyone knew it, and no one said it for a long time, because saying it meant choosing who. I have made some hard choices in a long life. I have shot horses I loved. I have signed a paper that took a man's land for a debt he couldn't pay and watched him load his family in a wagon and not meet my eyes. I have stood at gravesides and felt, under the grief, the cold private relief of the survivor, and hated myself for it. I am not a soft man, and I have never claimed to be. But I have never again been part of a choosing like the one we made in that tower, and I pray, in whatever way a man like me prays, that no one reading this ever has to. We could not send the weak. That was clear. A man who tired and sat down in that snow was a man who died, and a weak man tired faster, and so to send the weak was to spend lives we'd already saved. But the strong were the same men keeping the outer ring warm with their bodies, the same men who'd be needed if the fire faltered or the storm came back, and a strong man lost in the timber was a strong man we could not get back. Every hand that went down the hill was a gamble, the wood we needed against the life we might lose getting it. And the cruelest part, the part the arithmetic kept circling back to, was this: the trip there and back, breaking trail through that snow, dragging a load of green frozen timber, might cost a man more strength than the wood he brought would replace in heat. We might burn more life fetching the fuel than the fuel was worth. Elias laid it out. He'd done the figuring overnight on the stone of his own hearth with a piece of char, and he laid it before the grown men and women of the valley plainly, the way Dawn did things, without softening and without despair. So much would a day to keep 34 alive, so many trips to bring it, so many hands, and what each trip would likely cost. He did not pretend it added up. It did not add up. The honest sum said that some of us by April would not be here, and the only question the arithmetic left us was which, and how, and who chooses. And Daniel Greer with his daughter alive at his feet and 3 toes already gone black. Daniel Greer, who 2 weeks before had led the laughter. Daniel Greer stood up in the firelight and said, "I'll go down first, and I'll go down most. I owe a debt and I mean to pay it with my back since I've nothing else." I have thought about courage a great deal, in the years since, the way old men do who have time and a fire and not much company. I used to think courage was the thing that happens in an instant, the charge, the rescue, the hand thrust into the flame. I don't think that anymore. I think real courage is the thing Daniel Greer did, which is to look at a sum that says some of us will die and to volunteer, calmly, in front of his wife and children, to be among the ones most likely to be the answer. To choose to spend his life by the daily handful rather than gamble someone else's. He went down the hill that first morning, and he went down nearly every morning after, and he came back each evening grayer and thinner and quieter, and he never once, that I heard, spoke of the debt again. He just paid it, with his back, as he'd said. That was a kind of man I had not known lived among us, and he'd been there all along, hidden inside the loud, proud fool who'd mocked the tower, and it took the end of the world to bring him out. He was not the only one. That is the thing about the choosing. Once Greer stood, others stood. Tom Avery, who'd burned his bride's wagon and seemed half-burned himself by the doing of it. The younger Peterson, the unmarried one. 2 of the Ray's men, who had the least reason of anyone to spend themselves for a valley that had barely spoken to them, and who spent themselves anyway, and whose names, Esteban and Mateo, I am ashamed to say I learned only on the hill, only in the timber, only when we were dragging frozen logs side by side, and a man stops being a stranger somewhere in the 2nd mile of shared suffering. And me? I went too. My knees were bad and getting worse, and I was no longer young, but I went, because a man cannot watch Daniel Greer walk down that hill day after day and stay warm by the fire with his hands in his lap and still call himself a man. I went, and I have the scars of it. 2 fingers that never came back to full feeling, and a cough that took 30 years to kill me and is, finally, getting on with the job. I do not regret going. Of the things I have done in my life, it is nearly the only one I do not regret. The work itself was a misery I cannot fully give you, because the body, mercifully, forgets the texture of its worst pain even when the mind keeps the shape of it. We went down in pairs, roped together, because a man alone who broke through a drift into a hidden creek was a dead man, and a man with a partner sometimes wasn't. We broke trail through snow that came to the chest, each step a slow drowning, the cold burning in the lungs like swallowed fire. We reached the timber, and we cut what we could with axes that wanted to shatter in the cold rather than bite. You learned to warm the axe head in your coat before you swung. You learned 100 small things like that, the body teaching itself to live in a country that wanted it dead. We cut. And we dragged, and the dragging was the worst. The slow agony of hauling a frozen log uphill through chest-deep snow, with a rope cutting into a shoulder you could no longer feel. And the whole time, the fire at the top of the hill, the smoke standing straight in the still air, the promise of warmth that was also the reason for the work. You climbed toward it on the worst days the way a drowning man climbs toward light. I understood, dragging wood up the dead hill with my lungs full of fire and my shoulder raw, why man might build his whole life around a flame that would not go out. I understood Elias Crow in my body, in those weeks, in a way I never could have understood him in words. We lost a man. I have put off saying it, but I cannot leave it out, because to leave it out would be to make the story neater than the truth, and I promised myself when I started this that I would not do that. His name was Carl Peterson, the elder brother. He went down the hill on a morning in late February that seemed, by the standard we'd learned to live by, almost mild, only 20 below, the wind down, a thin sun. He went with his brother, roped together as we all did. And somewhere in the timber cutting, he simply sat down. His brother said afterward there was no warning, no stumble, no complaint. Carl set down the axe and sat in the snow and said he'd rest a moment, and his brother went on cutting, and when he turned back, Carl was leaning against the tree with his eyes open and the breath gone out of him, taken so quietly the snow on his shoulders hadn't even shifted. It happens like that in the deep cold. The body spends and then there is nothing left to spend, and the spending stops gently like a clock running down. There is no drama in it. That is the obscene thing about it, the thing I have never made peace with, that a man can go from living to dead in the time it takes his brother to cut through a single log, and the world does not so much as pause. His brother carried him up the hill, would not leave him, would not hear of leaving him, dragged Carl's body up the dead hill the same way we dragged the wood, roped over his own raw shoulder, weeping in a way that froze on his face. And we buried Carl Peterson as best we could, which was not well. The ground was iron. We could not dig. We built a cairn of the very stones Elias had quarried for the tower and never used, and we laid him under them at the foot of the hill where the fire's light just reached on the longest nights. And here is the thing I have carried since, the heavy thing, the thing I came to this story to set down before I go. That night in the tower, with Carl freshly under his cairn and the whole valley silent with the weight of it, the fire still needed feeding. The wood Carl had cut was the wood that kept his own children warm that night. We burned it. We had to. There was no ceremony we could afford that did not end with us burning the last work of his hands to keep his bobbies from following him into the cold. And I sat by that fire and I watched it burn the wood a dead man cut, and I understood at last, all the way down, what Elias had meant about the dead and the living, and why a man might weep with his face to a stone. We were keeping each other alive on the spent lives of each other. That was the arithmetic in the end, not a sum you solve, a debt you carry. The strain inside the tower was its own kind of winter. 34 people in a space built for 3 week upon week, in fear and grief and the constant gnawing of not quite enough. It does things to people. There were quarrels. There was a night 2 men came near to blows over a place by the fire, and it was Dawn again who stopped it, stepping between them with that look, saying the only thing that could be said. The fire does not care which of you sits closer. The cold will take you both the same. There was a woman who broke quietly, who sat for 3 days facing the wall and would not eat, and whom the other women fed by hand and held through the nights until something in her turned back toward the living. There was the slow, grinding erosion of dignity that hunger and cold and no privacy work on people. And there was, I will say this too, a tenderness that grew up in the same ground, unexpected, like the green that comes after a burn. Because here is what I did not expect, and what I have never forgotten. We were better in that tower than we had ever been in our scattered, comfortable cabins down in the draws. The meanness I told you about, the poor man's meanness that had made us laugh at a fool to feel less foolish ourselves, it could not survive in that close, warm dark. You cannot hate the man whose body is keeping your back from the cold. You cannot despise the family you are starving alongside. The Ray's children and the Greer children slept in a single pile of bodies and blankets like a litter of pups, and could not, after a few weeks, have told you which family they belonged to. Old Maddox, who could not walk, became the keeper of the children's spirits, telling them stories in a cracked voice through the long nights, and the man we'd half forgotten in his cabin became, in the tower, beloved. We learned each other's names. We learned each other's griefs. We became, in the worst weeks of our lives, something we had never managed to be in the good years, a people. And at the center of it, feeding the fire, was Elias Crow. He barely slept. I do not think I am exaggerating when I say I am not sure he slept at all those weeks. The fire was his, the keeping of it his, and he kept it the way I imagine a man keeps a vigil at a deathbed, with that total, exhausted, tender attention. He banked it through the warmest part of the day to stretch the wood. He built it high when the cold pressed hardest. He knew that fire the way I know my own heartbeat, knew when it wanted air and when it wanted feeding, knew to the stick how much we had and how long it would last, and he carried that knowledge, the daily, deadly knowledge of exactly how close we were to the end of the wood, alone, so the rest of us would not have to. He carried it until the night he could not carry it alone anymore. The night the wood detail came back with less than half a load because a new storm had buried the trail we'd broken, and Elias did the sum in the firelight with his char on the stone, and I watched his hand stop moving, and I watched him sit very still and look into his fire, and I understood, with a cold that had nothing to do with the weather, that the sum had finally come out the way we'd all feared it would. There was not going to be enough, not for 34, not the way we were going. And the storm that had buried our trail was, the men who'd come up the hill said, the front edge of something bigger, something coming down off the mountains. The kind of storm that, in a winter like this one, in a country like ours, did not break for days. Elias Crow set down his char. He looked across the fire at his wife, and something passed between them that 30 years of marriage would not have let me read, but that I felt the weight of even so. And then he stood up, in the crowded fire-lit dark with the whole sleeping, exhausted valley around him, and he said, in a voice pitched low so the children would not wake, "There's one more thing we can burn, but I'll not do it without the lot of you knowing what it is, and what it'll cost." "There's one more thing we can burn," Elias Crow said, "but I'll not do it without the lot of you knowing what it is, and what it'll cost." For a moment no one understood. We were too tired to understand quickly. The cold and the hunger had slowed our minds to the speed of the fire, which is to say to a low, steady burn that gave heat but not much light. We looked at him in the dark, 34 of us, the awake ones, and we waited, and the storm he'd warned of had begun to find the tower. I could hear it, the first long fingers of wind reaching over the lip of the dead hill and combing across the sod roof, a sound like something large and patient settling its weight against the door. Then Tom Avery, who was quicker than me, looked up, not at Elias, at the roof, at the poles. And I understood. The tower was stone, but a tower is not only stone. The roof was poles, good seasoned lodgepole, a dozen heavy timbers Elias had hauled up the hill across 2 summers and fitted with the same care he'd given everything, laid close and chinked and sodded over to hold the heat that kept us all alive. The door was oak, 2 inches thick, a door he'd built to stand against the wind for 100 years. There was the great beam over the hearth, the lintel, the frames, the loft floor where his boy slept, the rafters, the joists, the whole wooden skeleton inside the stone, the bones that held the body of the thing up. It would burn, all of it would burn, and it was dry. And it was a great deal of wood, more than the wood detail could bring up in a week of broken trail through a killing storm. It was, perhaps, enough to outlast the thing coming down off the mountains, enough, maybe, for 34. And to burn, it was to tear the tower apart with our own hands, to pull down the roof in the middle of a blizzard, to break open the sanctuary and feed it, piece by piece, into the very fire it had been built to shelter. The tower could not save us as a tower. It could only save us as fuel. To live, we would have to destroy the thing that was keeping us alive, and trust the stone walls and the great heat of its own burning to hold us through the storm in the wreckage. That was the arithmetic. That was the one more thing. But that was not the cost, and Elias knew it, and that is why he said what it'll cost with that particular weight, and that is why he would not do it without us knowing. Because the tower was not just a building to him. You know that. You have known it since the first part of this telling, since the day he set down his axe and told me he was keeping the fire for everything he loved that had gone cold while he looked away. The tower was a grave he had built for the living to use. It was a monument and a vow, and the whole shape of his grief made solid, raised on the one hill no one wanted, around a fire that would never die. And he was offering to burn it down to save us. I want to tell you that we refused, that someone stood up and said, "No, Elias, not your tower, will find another way." That is how the story would go if it were a tale, and God knows it has become a tale in the 80 years since, and in the tale somebody always says no. Nobody said no. We were going to die otherwise, and we knew it. And there is a terrible clarity in that knowledge that strips the romance off a man and leaves only the animal arithmetic of the next sunrise. We had children in that tower. We had burned our own homes already, our tables and cradles and the wagons we'd come west in, and we had buried Carl Peterson under the stones meant for a wall that would now never be built. We were long past the place where pride could afford us the luxury of refusing a thing that would keep us breathing. We looked at Elias Crow offering to burn his life's work, his grave for the dead, the fool's dream we had laughed at, and we let him. That is the heavy thing, not that he offered, that we accepted, that a whole valley let one man tear down the monument to his own dead so that we could go on living, and that we did not even have the grace to argue. I have made my peace with most of it, but I have never made my peace with that. We took the last thing he had and we fed it to the fire, and we were right to, and it was the worst thing I ever helped to do. He saw the acceptance in our faces. He had expected it, I think. He had done the sum on all of us long before, the way he did sums on everything. He nodded once, slow, and then he did the only thing in that whole night that came near to breaking me, more than Carl, more than the cold, more than the babies near dying. He went to his wife and his boy, and he spoke to them low in the Apache tongue I never learned, and I do not know what he said. But I saw Dawn close her eyes. I saw the boy, that silent boy who never spoke, who had carried water up the hill for 2 summers building the thing we were about to destroy. I saw the boy put his hand flat against one of the roof poles, the way you'd lay a hand on the flank of a horse you were about to put down. A goodbye. A 9-year-old saying goodbye to the bones of his father's grief, in the dark, in a storm, so that he and the children sleeping around him could see the spring. Then Elias picked up the axe, the same axe he'd set down the day I asked him why, and he reached up to the first roof pole, and he was the one to make the first cut. Of course he was. He would not let another man strike the first blow against the thing he'd built. He took it down himself, the first timber, and he laid it on the fire with his own hands, and the dry wood caught and roared up and threw a heat across that crowded room that I felt on my face like a benediction and a wound at the same time. And then the rest of us rose, and we helped him tear his tower apart. The storm came in full while we worked, and I have never seen its like before or since, and I have lived a long time in hard country. It came over the dead hill like the end of the world, a white screaming wall of wind and snow that wiped the stars and the valley, and the very idea of distance out of existence, until there was nothing in all the world but the inside of that stone shell, and the fire we were feeding it with its own ruined roof. The wind found every gap we opened in the sod and shrieked through it, and the cold came in behind the wind like a living thing, and we worked against it, pulling down poles, breaking them to length, feeding the fire, packing snow and hides into the holes overhead, all of us, the strong and the weak and the women and the older children, all of us working in the firelight while the storm tried to peel the roof off over our heads before we could burn it ourselves. It was a strange thing to be inside. We were destroying our shelter in the middle of a blizzard, and the more of it we burned the warmer we got and the more exposed we got, both at once, the fire roaring up huge and orange and throwing a heat we hadn't felt in months while overhead the storm reached in through the widening holes. Elias and Dawn worked the overhead, packing the gaps as fast as we opened them, trading roof for fire square by square, and the fire won the race. Barely. The great heat of all that dry seasoned wood burning at once filled the stone shell and pushed the cold back out through the gaps faster than the storm could push it in. And the 3-foot walls, the thick walls everyone had laughed at, the walls that made the tower look squat and foolish and overbuilt, those walls held the heat like a banked oven, and we lived. We lived through that night and the next day and the night after that, while the storm raged and broke and raged again, burning the bones of Elias Crow's tower in the heart of Elias Crow's tower. 34 souls packed around a fire that had finally, after all the months of dying slow, been given enough to burn. Old Maddox, who could not walk and who had become the keeper of the children's stories, told them through the worst of it that the storm was a great white bear that the fire was driving off, and the children believed him, and slept, and did not know that the warmth they slept in was the warmth of a man's grief burning down to ash above their heads. I knew. I sat against the stone with my bad knees and my frostbit fingers, and I watched the great beam over the hearth catch and burn, the lintel, the heart timber of the whole structure. The one Dawn had set with her own hands, and I watched Elia's crow watch it burn, and his face in the firelight was not the face of a man losing everything. It was the face of a man who had finally, after all these years, found the thing his fire was for. The storm broke on the third morning. It broke the way those great storms do, all at once, the wind dropping between one breath and the next into a silence so total it woke us by its absence, by the sudden cessation of the screaming we'd stopped hearing because it had become the whole world. We woke into a silence and a light, because the sun had come up over a valley scoured white and clean and utterly still, and it came in through the broken roof and fell across 34 living faces and the long, low coals of what had been a tower. We had burned nearly all of it. The roof was gone, the door, the loft, the beams. What stood was the stone shell, open to the sky, with a great bed of coals at its heart still throwing heat enough to keep us through the cold, clear days that we now, somehow, knew we would survive. The worst was over. The cold after that storm was deep, but it was the old honest cold, the kind that breaks in its season, and we had wood enough left in the coals and trail enough cleared by the storm's own packing to last us to the thaw. We had come through. 34 had come up the hill and 33 would walk back down it, and Carl Peterson lay under his cairn where the firelight had reached him on the long nights, and that was the price, and it was paid. We did not whoop or weep or fall on each other the way they do in the tailies. We were too far past that. We sat in the ruin of the tower in the clean, cold light, and we breathed, and we looked at each other, and there was a thing in the looking that I have spent my whole life trying to name and have never managed. Recognition, maybe. The recognition of people who have seen each other all the way to the bottom and back, and who will never again be able to pretend they are strangers, and who will carry each other in some quiet place for the rest of their days whether they ever speak of it or not. We did not mostly ever speak of it, but I knew, looking around that broken tower, that I was bound to every soul in it by something stronger than blood, and that the binding would not loosen as long as any of us lived. It hasn't. I am the last of them now, and it hasn't. Elia's crow stood up in the ruin of his life's work. In the morning light, his fire burned down to a great bed of coals that would not, that day, be fed. For the first time in 2 years, the fire on the dead hill was allowed to die. He let it, that is the thing. He had built the whole tower around a fire that would never go out, had made a vow of it, had named his grief and his purpose and his foolishness in the keeping of it. And on the morning we lived, he crouched by the coals and he did not feed them. He let the fire he'd built for the dead burn down at last, because it had done, finally, the only thing worth doing, the thing he had perhaps been waiting 2 years without knowing it for the chance to do. It had kept the living. And having kept the living, it could rest. I went and crouched beside him. My knees screamed, but I went. We watched the coals together, the two of us, the way we'd stood once before with a side of antelope between us and a question he'd answered in a way I hadn't understood. And I asked him, because I am a man who keeps a ledger, who has to have the words even when the words are too small for the thing, I asked him, "Will you build it again, Elias, come spring?" He was quiet a long while. The coals ticked and settled. Somewhere behind us a child laughed, the first laugh in that tower in months, a thin, bright, impossible sound in the clean, cold air. "No," he said, "I don't think I will." And I waited for him to say why, the way I'd waited 2 years before, and the way he had then, he did not give me the answer I expected. "I built it because I thought the fire was the thing that mattered," he said, "keeping it, never letting it go cold. I thought if I could just keep one fire alive long enough, it would." He stopped. His hands were open over the dying coals, taking the last of the heat. "It wasn't the fire," he said. "It was never the fire. I had it backwards the whole time." I did not understand him then. I want to be honest about that. I nodded the way you nod at a tired man, and I let it be, and we crouched there until the coals went gray, and then the valley began the slow work of climbing down off the dead hill toward homes we would have to dig out and rebuild and fill again with the long, ordinary business of living. I understood him later. It took me most of a lifetime, but I understood him in the end, and I will set it down here because there is no one left for me to say it to, and because a thing understood and never spoken is a kind of fire kept too long. He had built a fire that would never die for everything he loved that had gone cold while he looked away. He had thought the keeping of the flame was the way to honor the dead, to never let go, to never let anything go cold again, to stand vigil forever over a grief he could not put down. And what the winter taught him, what the burning taught him, was that you do not honor what you have lost by clutching it forever in the cold. You honor it by spending it, by letting it burn down into something that keeps the living warm. The fire mattered not because it never died, but because, in the end, he was willing to let it. He let it go to save us, and in the letting go, I have to believe, he finally set down the thing he'd been carrying up that hill for 2 years, the cold weight of everything he hadn't been in time to save. The fire on the dead hill went out the morning the valley lived, and Elias Crow walked down the hill lighter than he'd come up it, and he never built another tower, and he never needed to. They don't call it the Dead Hill anymore. The young people don't even know the name. There's a town in the valley now, a real one with a church and a school and a road, and the hill at the edge of it where the stone shell still stands open to the sky. They call it Crow's Hill, and most of them think it's named for the bird. The stone walls are still there. 80 years and the walls Elias Crow built 3 feet thick of fieldstone and his wife's careful eye are still standing, roofless, open, a ring of stone on a hill above a town that exists in some real and unbroken way, because 33 people once let a fool burn his dream to keep them warm. Children play in it. I've watched them. They climb the walls and hide in the round of it, and they have no idea, none of them, what those stones held, what they cost, whose grief raised them and whose lives they saved. I go up there still, when my knees and my cough will let me, which is less and less. I sit in the ring of stone where the fire used to be, and I take out my ledger, the same one, the one I carried up the hill inside my shirt against my skin, the one I could not burn, and some days I write, and some days I just sit. Last week I sat for a long time and watched the light come down through the open roof the way it did the morning we lived, and I thought about all of them, the whole vanished valley, Daniel Greer with his black toes and his paid debt, the Peterson brothers, the Ray's men whose names I learned too late and have never forgotten since, Dawn and her careful hands, the silent boy who put his palm to the pole in goodbye. And Elias Crow, who they called a fool, who was the least foolish man I ever knew. I never did learn the Apache word he called his wife by. It is the only entry in 80 years of keeping that I left a blank for, a small empty space on the page where the word should be. I have meant, all my life, to find someone who could teach me how to say it. I am running out of time too. But the walls are still standing, and the children still play there, and somewhere under the cairn at the foot of the hill Carl Peterson sleeps where the firelight used to reach him. And on a clear cold morning, if you sit in the ring of stone and you are very still and you have lived long enough to know what you're listening for, I think you can almost feel where the fire was.